This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
Hi, Sg2 Perspectives listeners. We are trying something fun and maybe a little dangerous. On May 22nd, we're hosting a live podcast where you can join us for the recording of an episode. Our relationship right now is a little one-sided and we want to meet you. So we'll put you in my chair. You can ask us questions, share your insights, or just heckle us. There's more information in the show notes, but you do need to register so you can get a link to attend. Hope to see you there.
We could talk about sports medicine solely when it comes to this. Just the increase of our older population participating in sports is driving huge growth across emergency visits, imaging, fractures, strains and sprains, you name it. And that growth has been prevalent for a few years, and we're just continually seeing more and more participation by that over 65 age group. And that's really what's driving our 10% projection in sports medicine.
Hello and welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I am thrilled to have here today a few of our service line experts as another installment in our Impact of Change podcast series. Today we're going to talk all things acuity as it relates to our cardiovascular, orthopedics, and neuro service lines. I have with me Josh Aaker, Donnelle Jageman, and Kate Zentner. Thrilled to have you here today.
Hi, Tori. Glad to be here.
Hi, Tori.
Want to start first with cardiovascular. Josh, going to point this question to you. When I think about some of the key stories coming out of the CV service line this year, it all centers around this general rising patient acuity, particularly as we have the older population have increased incidence of cardiovascular disease. What were some of the key themes that you were thinking about as you built the CV forecast this year?
Tori, you're spot on, because a lot of what's driving the cardiovascular forecast is the aging of the population. All of the baby boomers are now post 65. We're really seeing how the aging of the population affects the utilization of care. This year, our inpatient cardiovascular adult forecast is plus 8%. And that's quite high, particularly as we think about all of the things that we've done to move patients out of the inpatient space, either to outpatient in the hospital or to other sites of care or at home. But unfortunately, we're competing against this rising tsunami. We're going to have to hunker down and think not only about some of our procedural spaces that we continue to see growth in, such as transcatheter valves, still at 126% over the next 10 years, or CABG at plus 4% over that same decade. We also need to be really cautious about our CHF population, which we know is growing on the inpatient side by about 12%. As you think about the growth in some of these higher acuity surgical procedures, remember that medical DRGs are over 60% of the inpatient CV population. So if you want to make room for some of those growing surgeries or procedures, then make sure that you're also thinking about your medical population and whether you can safely shift those to other sites of care.
That brings us to an interesting push and pull that exists with this forecast. Is all growth good growth? Or are there perhaps pockets of increasing demand or utilization where we need to deploy a mitigation strategy?
Yeah, one of the ways to step back from the question, but then also answer it, is to think about managing this as a service line, so that as much as we want to think about some of those higher acuity congestive heart failure procedures like VADs, like heart transplant, know that a ton of that population is actually in the outpatient space and thinking about home nursing, home infusions. Balancing those two is going to be important, and it's not just picking one or the other. You have to pick both. Another example of that is growth of transcatheter valve procedures, 126%. And that includes TAVR, which we know is the bulk of that population. We're seeing a ton of new innovations coming down the pike. So, for example, we just saw the TriClip being approved. This is going to open up many more patients for certain types of interventions. We know that mitral and pulmonic and tricuspid valves are coming, and that's going to continue to grow that population. It means that then that our surgical valve forecast is still negative. We're looking at a negative 4% over the next 10 years. We're going to also have to think about the growth on the outpatient space. So a plus 35% for heart valve disease on the outpatient side. Every time you do an inpatient for that CV, because we're a progressive chronic disease service line, you're probably going to grow a ton of volume also on that outpatient. So you're really managing everything at the same time. And a programmatic approach can really help with that.
Josh, I really like the way that you framed that. And a key component of providing really great care to those cardiovascular patient populations, it does center around the programmatic approach. And what does it mean to really build out the right continuum of care for the select cohorts that fall within the CV bucket? As we think about how an approach needs to be different for some of those different patient populations, I'm thinking dysrhythmia versus coronary heart disease versus atrial fibrillation. What are some of the key considerations that you discuss with our members here?
When we think broadly about AFib, and AFib rolls under our dysrhythmia care family, new guidelines came out that really recommend a disease-based lab or a clinician-led program. As we're thinking about the tremendous growth in our electrophysiology procedures, forecasting nearly 50% growth for those intracardiac catheter ablations over the next decade, and also 18% growth for pacemakers and ICDs over that same time point. That's a huge volume of patients. Most of them are going to be in the hospital outpatient department. That makes it a little bit easier in the fact that they won't be having these long lengths of stays. They won't be in those beds. But it also is challenging, meaning you're going to have to get those patients out in a really efficient way. A program-directed solution is really the only way that we've seen organizations meet the need and, in reality, prepare for the next coming decade.
It's interesting when we consider the evolution of surgical services as it relates to this service line. For years, this was something that was so heavily inpatient focused. And now we're starting to see the migration of procedural volumes for select procedures from inpatient to the outpatient care setting. Is this a question that you frequently receive from members in terms of what makes sense to push outpatient? Does it make sense to stand up a cardiovascular ASC?
First, there is a difference between types of patient. Broadly, when we talk about diagnostic cath, we're forecasting a 17% decline over the next decade. This is consistent year over year. We've seen the appropriate use criteria. We've seen replacement of diagnostic cath with advanced imaging, particularly CT. When we break those out into our inpatient versus outpatient diagnostic forecast, our outpatient diagnostic forecast over the next 10 years for adults is negative 22%, whereas our inpatient diagnostic cath for that same year and same patients is only negative 1%. Thinking about what type of patients are you moving? Are these stable patients that can be scheduled, or are these patients that are really complex, that really need a lot more care, that they actually just need inpatient services, whether they could have actually left under that 2 days or not, either because they're frail, because they're older, because they just need a lot more management from other disciplines. So when you're thinking about moving stuff off campus, it's really understanding what can you move, what is acceptable or will be reimbursed from a regulatory perspective, but also what makes sense from the resources, from the training, from the organization perspective. And so that's where we go to our 2023 guidelines from the Society for Cardiovascular Angiography and Interventions, where they updated their guidelines for doing PCI without surgical backup. And in that guideline, they really talk about how you can risk stratify your patients where, yes, maybe an ASC is acceptable, but what are the different clinical and not necessarily captured in either our forecast or outside of an EHR? It is still a common question that I get about the cardiovascular ASC. It does open up the conversation of, well, if we need to build a new lab, does it have to be on the hospital campus? And I would say not anymore, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make sense from a clinical, physician alignment, from a supply chain, or even from a capital investment perspective. And these are the 4 different considerations that we usually walk through our clients with.
On the other end of the spectrum, when we think about a service line that has robust outpatient surgical capabilities, we've got orthopedics. Donnelle, I'm curious, as we think about some of the key considerations that were incorporated in this year's 2024 Impact of Change forecast, what are you seeing in the orthopedics and sports medicine space as it relates to increasing surgical acuity?
Tori, oh my gosh, we could talk about sports medicine solely when it comes to this. Just the increase of our older population participating in sports is driving huge growth across emergency visits, imaging, fractures, strains and sprains, you name it. And that growth has been prevalent for a few years, and we're just continually seeing more and more participation by that over 65 age group. And that's really what's driving our 10% projection in sports medicine is that age cohort. And not only their continued participation, but also the kinds of activities that they're participating in. There has been a decrease in activities like dancing, but an increase in more rigorous athletic pursuits. So we've actually seen more fractures than sprains and more contusions than bruises. And that is all leading to this rising acuity for that patient population. And it also means we have to change the way that we care for those patients.
Donnelle, what I think is interesting is we have this increasing complexity of this patient population in an environment in which so much of this care has shifted outpatient. So we have to pretty quickly then scale capabilities in those outpatient care sites, making sure that we can provide that fracture care in an urgent or office clinic versus care simply for a sprain. How have organizations navigated that shift in care provision?
There certainly have to be new access points and even specific clinics for these folks, because caring for a sports medicine injury in someone over 65 is not the same as caring for that same injury in someone who's 25 or even 45. There's really a more intense need for things like physical therapy, bracing, and even recovery in their lifestyle. So something like occupational therapy, where their injury may impact their ability to care for themselves. When it comes to things like surgical recovery and how members and physicians are addressing older populations who may actually be more mobile now, we're seeing people enter their more mature years, maintaining an active lifestyle and being more and more mobile. Physicians are prepared to still perform outpatient surgeries on these folks, but what health systems and our communities need to do is ensure that there's aftercare available for them. The hesitation with moving some of these older patients to outpatient settings isn't necessarily about the care in the outpatient setting or what happens in the recovery afterwards, because we know patients do better at home, but it's, do they have a support network? Are there services arranged to help them care for themselves, especially in that 3 to 5 days post-surgery? That's really critical that they get up and moving and that they're still eating healthfully and they're going to their appointments and taking their medication. That's the period and the portion of the care that the surgeons are concerned with.
Makes sense. And tell me, from a supply perspective, where do we stand in terms of making sure that those access points are available for this growing patient population? I fully recognize that I live in a bit of a bubble. I'm in a densely populated area, and so it feels like on every street corner there's a rehab or physical therapy clinic, but I recognize that that probably isn't the case nationally.
It's definitely more challenging for our more rural health systems and our more rural members. And it is something that we have brainstormed and troubleshooted a lot with those. And I anticipate we'll see more and more innovative and tertiary type. And when I say tertiary, I don't mean acuity level, but on the spectrum of what we deem healthcare as a service. So something more like that community social work service that our health systems will have to expand into to take care of these patients. Even something like joint replacement patient that is in their 80s. If they have a life expectancy until they're 92, this particular patient, if they're in relatively good health, they would still need a joint replacement. But I anticipate in those rural communities, we'll see that the health systems might take on that role of the support post-discharge so that they continue to discharge them outpatient to the best setting for them and that they have the best ability to recover. For our suburban and city life folks like myself and you, it does seem like there's something everywhere. Just like down the street from my house, there's the physical therapy and the facial place and the juice bar far, all in the same block. It just seems like you can get everything right outside your door. Those environments and those markets are really well prepared to do this. It's really the rural and further suburban areas that will have to bolster their programs to take care of these patients.
Donnelle, you were just talking about access, and I think that's a really important point also from the cardiovascular perspective. Yes, we are anticipating robust growth on that inpatient side. It also means that we're anticipating growth in things like the average length of stay. Sure, it's going up plus 1% for the CV service line overall, and that equals plus 9% bed days going up. But there's a very different story when you talk about our surgical cases and DRGs versus our medical DRGs. Our surgical DRGs are anticipated to grow 21%, which is great, but that average length of stay is forecasted to decline 10%. So that makes it a little bit easier that we're getting our surgical patients out a little bit faster. But if you look at the medical DRG side, we're anticipating to grow those volumes plus 1% over the next decade, but the average length of stay is forecasted to grow plus 7%. So now our inpatient bed space from a CV perspective is a lot of medical cases. Can we think about different access points, whether that's a same-day access clinic or direct access clinic for heart failure patients? Can we think about leveraging our clinician-led disease-based clinic for AFib to help mitigate some of those admissions and thinking, can we get them seen in the outpatient and then treated longer term at home by connecting them with tertiary resources, as Donnelle was talking about? It's really important to understand that as we want to grow some volumes, we have to understand the mix that's in our inpatient and leveraging that full cadre of sites of care to help provide great spaces for our middle acuity to low acuity inpatient admissions.
Absolutely. And Josh, in addition to focusing on who those patients are, be they medical, surgical, high acuity, low acuity, you hit it. It's really increased emphasis on systemness. This is something that we've seen really great success with in certain clinical areas, stroke being one of those key areas where organizations have put so much effort and investment in really building out the right sites of care for the right patients. And Kate, as our neurosciences expert, I'm curious, what are some of the lessons that have been learned on the stroke side of things to drive some of this care optimization?
This concept of service distribution, although it's been about 10 years since thrombectomy became standard of care, and programs have come really far in terms of figuring out what that right network approach, whether it's a hub and spoke or something more distributed, should look like. We're not done. And part of this is because of some new opportunities that we foresee in the future related to intracerebral hemorrhage. Now, we've gotten to a point from a technology perspective where we're starting to see some benefit demonstrated through the ENRICH trial, where for ICH, we've tried this for years and there have been a number of studies, but we've advanced to the point where we can execute on that hematoma evacuation to where it's probably going to be beneficial, which is great. This historically has been an incredibly dire, high complexity patient population without anything in the way of advanced treatment availability. We've actually built some growth into our forecast for that. The trick, though, Tori, is that this is going to be a particular subset of intracerebral hemorrhage who will probably benefit from minimally invasive surgery. So now you're looking at a subpopulation of a subpopulation. The volumes are going to be niche, and this is still going to be a patient population that requires a whole lot of infrastructure and expertise to care for, not just the surgical procedure itself, but the post-procedure care as well. This is going to be one where how much do we distribute versus what is the scale that we need? What is that minimum volume threshold that we need in order to really make this a good idea is going to be key. Those service distribution conversations for stroke patients are going to be continuing and continue to be a high priority topic among our members.
That makes a ton of sense. When I think about the neurosciences service line, there is so much growth that's associated with this patient population, both on the inpatient as well as the outpatient side. What are some of the ways that you encourage members to think about capturing some of that growth? Obviously, increased emphasis on systemness is one of those things, but when I think about all of the disruption happening in this space, given some of the innovation and technology advances, it seems like we're continuously moving the goalpost. So I'm curious, how do members stay on top of then offering first-class services to this patient population?
We are moving the goalpost all the time, which is why for stroke patients, your program needs to constantly be working with EMS because that really is your primary feeder, as well as understanding what perhaps your spoke sites are going to need, what education, how can we keep everybody on top of the latest in the way that we're caring for these patients. So that's one side of it. There are a lot of diverse patient populations that fall under that neurosciences umbrella. You take something like epilepsy, and that's a lot about partnerships and feeders. But you take something like dementia, where this is such a big population. And as we continue to see the population aging, it's growing quite a lot as well. That not only is about how you drive volume to specialized services, but it's also about how you can support the community, because you're never going to have enough geriatricians, enough neurologists. Your specialty workforce is never going to be enough to meet that growing demand. There we see the flip side of that channel management with feeders. We see it also being about how you can support the community to keep patients aging in place, help primary care feel more adequately prepped to deal with that. That's the other side of it as well, is helping create those resources, whether it's something virtual through a Project Echo for either primary care or even folks that work in assisted living and nursing homes. There are two very different sides to both how you drive and keep the volume that you're getting appropriate so that we can care for as many patients as possible.
There do seem to be different growth opportunities across all three of these service lines, but a few universal truths, which are, how do you ensure the right access at the right time for the right suite of services, which is just a really complex challenge for organizations to solve in a fairly resource-constrained environment these days. A continued area of learning more about the innovation that's coming down the pike for some of our select service lines are the opportunity for our subject matter experts like yourselves to go to industry-wide conferences. And Donnelle, you earlier this year attended a major orthopedic conference, AAOS, and I'm curious, what are some of the key learnings that were discussed there that you think are heavily applicable to our forecasting methodology moving forward?
AAOS is always such an adventure, first of all, but also a wealth of knowledge and information. The learnings really spanned everything from what we were just talking about to who has access and what that access looks like, and what do we do with patients on this continuum of care, all the way through some really interesting innovations that will change the site of care that we see patients in, and also the scope of patients that we can care for. Something that Kate and I have been looking at really recently, and that spans orthopedics and spine, are these very patient-specific technologies, including implants. We have already seen huge improvements in this in shoulder replacements. That is something that continues to drive our shoulder replacement forecast, that is actually at 92% growth projection for our 10-year forecast. Huge growth here. Definitely the smallest volumes of our major joint replacement forecast out of hip and knee and shoulder. Those innovations in patient-specific implants and approaches have expanded the clinical eligibility for shoulder replacements. And where I think we will see the next boost in that is actually in ankle replacements. Ankle replacements have historically not been as successful as other joint replacements because it is just a tricky small joint that is carrying the entire weight of your body. And a lot of ankle replacements have eventually ended up as fusions. But we're seeing across spine and orthopedics a movement to preserve motion. Kate can talk a lot about the innovations in spine technology that are focused on the same thing, that preservation of movement and also patient-specific technologies.
Yeah, Donnelle, that's something else that's going to hit our forecast a little bit as well. Patient-specific implants in the orthopedic side, but also when you think about spine surgery, it's this idea of artificial disc replacement and motion preservation rather than doing fusions. It's been around for a little while, but it's just getting to the point now where the payment as well as the evidence for that has expanded to the point where we will see more of that pick up. On the adult side, it's mostly outpatient, and that will take away eventually a little bit of the volume where you would have had to fuse, and now you can do a motion preservation procedure. On the pediatric side, you'll also see motion preservation procedures, but that's a whole different thing. It's more inpatient focused and about vertebral body tethering. But again, it's this idea of how can we, specific to the patient, preserve some of that motion and get more individualized treatment.
And we did reflect that transition to motion preservation in the 2024 forecast, where we're projecting a 25% 10-year growth rate for motion preservation procedures in spine. And some of those volumes will come from cervical and lumbar fusion.
Donnelle, Kate, I love those stories. I think it's fun to see how the forecast continues to evolve with some of those advances in technology and innovation. I'm curious, Kate, what else related to neurosciences is out there that is top of mind for you and your meet as you lead the neuroservice line?
Another hot topic that we are following right now is the growing use of ultrasound as a therapeutic. And this year, we've actually started to build the impact of high-intensity focused ultrasound into our forecast. For now, it's really about essential tremor that we can capture, but there are going to be some other indications available that are already around if you think about tremor-dominant Parkinson's disease, those sorts of things. And we're expecting a number of other indications available that we're watching for the future, too. It's that high-intensity focused ultrasound is an ablative technology where we think that's really going to expand the pool of candidates who may be able to get some sort of advanced treatment option on the essential tremor side. Eventually, we'll also start to see low intensity ultrasound as a way to open up the blood-brain barrier. A lot of really cool investigational future-facing things going on there. The other one is there's always a big interest from our membership in neurointerventional procedures. For those who do carotid work, which overlaps with cardiovascular, there has been a shift in guidance for angioplasty eligibility where less complete occlusions now are going to be fair game. So that's driving a little bit of growth. We don't forecast it yet, but we've also seen a lot of organizations start to talk about adopting MMA embolization, middle meningeal artery, over the last couple of years for subdural hematomas. And as the population ages, we believe that is going to be a group that's really growing in need. So a lot of cool stories and things that are going to boost and continue to see a lot of growth in some of these neurointerventional cases.
Awesome. It's so exciting. Josh, Donnelle, Kate, thank you so much for joining today and sharing your expertise here. Every year that we get to update the forecast and I get to learn the new innovations and stories that you're baking into that refresh, it's always just so exciting to hear what's coming down the pike. Thank you so much for joining. And listeners, hope you enjoyed this episode.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at SG2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, SG2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You can find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.